Let me say hello to all of those who tuned in and prepared for this interview. I am Alexander Williams Jr. I'm a retired federal judge. I sat on the United States District Court for the District of Maryland for 20 years. I am now the founder and executive director of the Judge Alexander Williams Jr. Center for Education, Justice, and Ethics. And we're at the University of Maryland. And please go to my website if you want to know something more about the center. That's www.judgeawcenter at umd.edu. So anyway, I'm privileged today and honored to interview Mr. Etan Thomas, a civil rights warrior. I call him par excellence. Little about Mr. Thomas. He was born in 1978 in Harlem, raised in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He attended Syracuse University. Mr. Thomas is an 11-year veteran of the NBA from 2001 to 2011. He was a center and a power forward with three teams: the Washington Wizards, the Oklahoma City Thunder, and the Atlanta Hawks. Most of his career was with the Washington Wizards, and I did share with him that I'm a long-term Wizard fan. Almost flunked out of college going to all those Wizards games back in the 60s. But Etan played with some very terrific players across the years. He was teammates of Antoine Jameson and Gilbert Arenas and Karan Butler, Brendan Haywood, Juan Dixon, Larry Hughes, Jared Jeffries, Jerry Stackhouse, Kwame Brown, Richard Hamilton, Tyrone Lue, who coaches, of course, the Clippers now. And I will say that he also was a teammate of Michael Jordan, who came here to Washington after his second or third retirement or whatever. He played a little while with the Wizards. Etan Thomas is a poet. He's a motivational speaker. He's a powerful and articulate advocate for justice. He is also the author of several books, including We Matter, Athletes and Activism, More Than Athletes. He also wrote a book, Fatherhood, Rising to the Ultimate Challenge, and he's the author of another book called Voices of the Future. And so, Etan, we're just delighted to have you with us this morning, and I'm going to ask you a couple questions so the audience would get to know you and your philosophy a little better. Can you share with the audience what triggered your interest, or what was the source of your passion and interest in transforming tradition and history and culture of racial injustice and racism?
Well, first, thank you for having me and doing this interview. I really do appreciate it. It's been a passion of mine for a long time, since I was pretty much younger. Going back to, my days in Tulsa, Oklahoma in middle school. I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and I think in seventh grade, and that's when I started to being aware of my surroundings and asking questions. So why are certain things certain ways? So I think that's really where it started with my new book, Police Brutality and White Supremacy: The Fight Against American Traditions. I go a little bit deeper from my previous book, We Matter, that you mentioned, Athletes and Activism, where I was really encouraging athletes to continue using their voices and their platforms to speak out on different topics in the history of Bill Russell and Muhammad Ali. And so I interviewed a lot of different athletes. This book, I'm going a little bit deeper into the topic. And, it's a complex topic. This is a topic that has been, plaguing our country for centuries. But I wanted to take a little bit of different approach, and having a lot of voices being part of the discussion and bringing their different experiences and opinions and platforms to this discussion. So that was my aim with this new book.
All right. Now, you mentioned, of course, professional athletes. I want to ask the question before we get into a little about your book. What is the importance of professional athletes expressing their voices and speaking out and engaging in activities addressing racism, injustice, disparities, and inequities? What's the importance?
Well, I think as an athlete, you have a tremendous platform you have the ability to really use your platform in really effective ways. And that's really what I wanted to show in We Matter. One of the people that I interviewed was Javaris Fulton, who is Trayvon Martin's brother. And he talked firsthand about the power of, the influence when LeBron James and Dwayne Wade and the entire Miami Heat wore the hoodies and posed in the picture and started talking about his brother. He said that was really, the introduction of what happened to his brother to the world. He said if it weren't for athletes and entertainers and everybody using their platform, he said that he doesn't think that anybody would know his brother's name right now, talking about Trayvon Martin. And it was interesting because I didn't understand why he said that. And I asked him, I was like, well, that's kind of, drastic. Like, why do you say that? And he said, well, at first, the family was trying to get the local news to cover the story. And that's something that a lot of people didn't know. And they didn't want to cover it. They said, well, there's no video. This is just a black man that got killed. That's not really newsworthy. He said, but then when the athletes got involved, then that brought it to a national attention. So that's just an example of the power of the athlete voice.
All right. We're talking with Etan Thomas, a former NBA star. And you see showing on the screen there, you see the books that he has written there, and you see his degree from Syracuse University and other written material. Now, Etan, let's talk about your new book, Police Brutality and White Supremacy, again, Transformation of Culture. You shared the information in that book from a collection of interviews that you had with family members of loved ones killed by the police, with police officers, with athletes, with media personalities and others, and you're asking their views about Rodney King, the Central Park Five, George Floyd case. And I guess the question I want you to share with those who've tuned in today, from those interviews, what conclusions have you drawn with respect to police conduct, police policies and practices, and the effect that this behavior by the police has had on people? What conclusions have you drawn, observations?
Oh, there's so much. I mean, dealing with the family members of the victims of police brutality, it was heartbreaking. Like, those are really difficult interviews to do. And I did a lot of them in this book. Tatiana Jefferson's family, Botham Jean's family, I could, keep going down the list. And, what I found is a common denominator in all of these discussions where they're all fighting for laws to be changed in their particular city, where what the police have done they won't be able to legally continually do. And that's the issue. A lot of the things in the laws that are on the books, why it's so difficult to prosecute a police officer, is because a lot of the language in the laws. We talked about qualified immunity. We talked about what some places in each department has different sets of issues. Some departments, they still don't have body cameras, which is crazy that now you're still fighting for that. But talking to the police officers were really, crucial, because I wanted to do that because since We Matter, I did a lot of panel discussions, things like that. And I would involve police officers in the discussions. And a lot of times we're talking, I'm like, well, they recognize there's a problem. They recognize that there's an issue and they want things to change. And because accountability helps them as well. So they came up with different solutions, different things that could be implemented. And I thought it was really impactful to have their voices mixed in with all the other voices to show it's not a anti-police type of a situation. It's a how can we police better in this country.
All right. I am retired Judge Alexander Williams, the executive director of the Judge Alexander Williams Jr. Center for Education, Justice, and Ethics. And my guest today is Etan Thomas, a veteran of the NBA, 11-year veteran, and an author and poet and motivational speaker. Etan, can you give us the title of your book again so those tuning in can go out and get it?
So the title is Police Brutality and White Supremacy, the Fight Against American Traditions.
All right. I've already had an advance copy of it, just an exciting book. I want to make sure you get a chance to go out and get that book. Etan, among the most hotly ways to address police brutality and to achieve police reform is what has been coined and widely discussed as defunding the police.
Mhm.
You talk about that in your book. Uh, if you advocate defunding the police, what is your definition of this concept referred to as defunding the police?
So, and this is a very interesting. I've been asked about this chapter quite a bit in the interviews that I've done. And first you have to like peel back the misconceptions of what the word defund means. A lot of times you have to say, okay, no, it doesn't mean abolish. That's a different word. It doesn't mean get rid of. It means defund. And so what I wanted to do was also show cases where defunding the police really would have applied in the situation. So specifically, I interviewed two people, Corey McCoy, who is the brother of Willie McCoy, and the sisters of Tatiana Jefferson. Now, in both of these cases, they were nonviolent, nobody had a gun or anything like that, but the call was made for a wellness check. For Willie McCoy, he was in Vallejo, California, and he was at a Taco Bell, and he was asleep in the car in a parking lot. Long story short, the person inside the Taco Bell called the police and said, "Can you just check on him to make sure he's okay?" Well, the police came with guns ablazing and shot up the whole car, and they said they thought they saw a gun. There was no, record of a gun or anything like that. But the issue is, if you're only taught and trained to be able to handle everything with a hammer, then everything is going to look like a nail to you. And so there are some situations where that's not needed. A wellness check, mental health issues. We have mental health crisis in this country. So the thought is that, in talking with the policemen, they said, okay, we're not handled to train or trained to handle some of these situations. And they all agree with that. And it's like, okay, so why don't we have somebody else in charge who is trained to handle this situation and give them the funding for that department, so that when you have a mental health crisis and you have a wellness check or something like that, you're not calling the people who are trained to handle everything with the gun, but you're trained to handle everything with de-escalating specifically situations. So that's where, in those specific cases, defunding the police would have applied. And it's defunding the police has become weaponized politically as something completely different than what it was. So I wanted to break down exactly what it was and illustrate examples where it makes logical sense to have somebody who is trained to deal with a certain situation be the ones who actually deal with that situation.
So rather than eliminating the police, your view is that there should be a reallocation of some of the resources to groups that can better handle situations.
Definitely. Well, and defunding doesn't mean eliminating. Defunding doesn't mean abolishing. It's been weaponized to mean different things. But yes, reallocating of funds to have people who are trained to be able to deal with mental health issues and things of that nature, be the ones to be called when you have to deal with those. There's so many different cases where it was just handled completely the wrong way, and they usually end in tragedy.
Great. Black women have been significantly victimized by law enforcement. For those who just think it's only Black men or Hispanic men, there's been a lot of Black women who've been victimized. Can you discuss the uniqueness and the important experience which Black women bring to the table as Black police officers?
So as Black police officer, I interviewed Captain Sonia Pruitt, who was she was actually the first captain in Montgomery County, first Black woman captain in Montgomery County. Great, it was amazing. I sat on panels with her, so I wanted to interview her for the book, and she talked about some of those struggles of being a Black woman police officer. She was head of the National Black Police Officers Association, and they were, speaking out on different things. So I was really, intrigued and respected, her perspective and of standing up for what is right while wearing blue. And that's something that you just didn't really see a lot. So I wanted to really magnify that. But also, that dealing with that chapter, I wanted to show how Black women are a lot of times left out of this conversation. I'm talking with my daughter. I remember my daughter Imani is 14 years old. She loves Maryland. We just went to the Maryland volleyball game back in December. But I showed her the interview that I did with Chiquisha Clemens. And Chiquisha Clemens was someone, a young sister who was beaten at a Waffle House in Alabama. And the things that were brought out of that conversation and the questions and why this is not shown. I mean, yeah, you've heard of Breonna Taylor and Sandra Bland, but those are really like a handful of cases that you've heard with Black women, where Black women are having issues where they're being brutalized and victimized and killed at alarming rates in these situations with police, and it's not really getting the attention that it should get. So I wanted to really focus on it in that chapter. And it was, it's an important topic to be able to really discuss, because as we as Black parents have to have the talk with our sons, we also have to have the talk with our daughters. And being a father, I put a lot of my personal experiences into the book and talk about, dealing with my kids and talking to my kids about things a lot. So I did a lot of that in that chapter.
Sure, certainly, excellent point, and we hope that many Black women will read the book, again, Police Brutality and White Supremacy, and get a lot of information, good information on the significance of what has happened with Black women. Let me move on. The Charlottesville incident, the January 6th incident, the far right groups, the wearing of Confederate flags, and those who are now increasingly participating in hate groups are some of the examples that you cite to lift up the term white supremacy and white privilege. Mm-hmm. Have you found that this conversation about white supremacy and white privilege is difficult and complex for some people to grasp?
Oh, definitely. It's definitely difficult. And it's interesting. I was honestly, it was this morning. I saw that there was Nicholas Langford. His name. He was a follower of the QAnon and one of the Trump supporter domestic terrorists who stormed the Capitol. And he received 44 months in prison for assaulting multiple police officers. Now, I've been doing a lot of work with young people in correctional facilities and things of that nature. And I know young people who have received longer sentences than that, than for possession of marijuana. So there really are two Americas that exist. So that what happened in January 6th was a prime example of white privilege. I interviewed Jamel Hill for that chapter, and she said, Black people, we couldn't have even like had the thought bubble to do something like that. It would have been a massacre. Like the response would have been, and it's amazing when you have the conversation of white privilege and people are still kind of resistant to it, and you have all of these examples. So what I did in the book, especially in the next chapter with white privilege, right after I talked about January 6th, was to interview specifically only white people for them to discuss. Because a lot of times, there's a segment of this country that'll hear it differently when they hear it from white people. That's just the way that it is. So I interviewed Sue Bird, who everybody loves from the WNBA, and she talked about white privilege. And Rex Chapman, who's a beloved former NBA player, he talked about it as well. And Tim Wise, who's an educator, and he talked about how white privilege is intertwined into education. And it's a chapter that I really want a lot of white people in particular to pay attention to, because these are white people telling you about their experiences with white privilege, and people who really want to be allies, how the first thing they have to realize and embrace the privilege that they do stand in. And that's something that is difficult. It's a difficult conversation for a lot of white people to have with white people, but it's received a little bit differently when you have a white voice saying that. So that's why I interviewed those particular people.
All right, talking with Etan Thomas, author and poet and former veteran of the NBA. Etan, there are two chapters in your book described as whitewash education and media and whitewash Christianity. Let me first ask you to talk to us about the media and historians leaving out information and distorting the truth and providing misinformation.
Right. So I talked to Cenk Uygur from the Young Turks, and he talked about a lot of how the media has been used to build up a fear of Black people from a long time ago. We talked about, we quoted Malcolm X a lot because it's crazy because the same quotes that we were using from Malcolm X back in the 60s, the media still does now. And it was just a way of weaponizing You know, whether you see a young black man who is accused of something, and the way that they demonize him, or you see a black person who was unarmed, who is the person who was killed by the police. They're the ones who are demonized on you know, through the media. It's really an amazing thing to see that it still goes on. We talked about the history of it. We went all the way back to Birth of a Nation, and then came all the way up until now. And it's you know, it's tough because a lot of people watch, you know, and it's not just Fox News. We talked about Fox News a lot, but it's not just them. But people who only watch that, they have a certain view of the world, and it's scary sometimes, because you're hoping that things are getting better, and then you turn on Fox News and just watch a few segments, and you're like, oh wow, things are not getting better at all. And you're seeing how things, so even talking about January 6th and the way that they were described, not that it was a domestic terrorist, you know, insurrection that, you know, and the giving it the proper violence in it initially, but it was like they were talking, oh, they were demonstrators, they were protesters, and, you know, they just wanted to exercise their rights to be, and it was like, I'm looking at the screen and seeing something completely different. But then you look at different Black Lives Matter protests, and you see literally people with signs, with water, you know what I mean? And they're describing, oh, they're violent, they're this, and it becomes a demonization. And there's a lot of people in mainstream America who believe everything that they hear from the media. And there's a reason why Malcolm X said that the media is the most powerful entity on earth. I'm paraphrasing, but he said because they have the ability to shape minds and public perception, and that's what happens right now. The media, it's a tough thing, because you see things being portrayed even, you know, all the time, and they have the ability to shape public opinion.
Yeah, and not portrayed. And I go back to where you grew up in Tulsa. I didn't know anything about the Black Wall Street until I saw it being reported the last few years. You grew up in Tulsa. Is that
Right.
another example of misinterpreting and leaving out history?
And we talked about that a lot. You know, it's interesting because my middle school is literally Carver Middle School in Tulsa, is literally like about 6 minutes away from where Black Wall Street was. And so I grew up with the knowledge. We knew what happened. We you know, heard about it. We studied it with everything. And then when I went to Syracuse, I was so amazed that so many people had never heard of it. Like, they didn't even know anything. You know, the country is just learning about Black Wall Street and what happened with the Tulsa Race Massacre and the riots like a few years ago, because it was depicted in the movies. But I learned about that in middle school. I was like, wow, but that's part of the miseducation. You know, Tim Wise made a really good point in the book. He was like, well, you know, part of the brainwashing of white supremacy starts, he said, in kindergarten. You know, he's like, if you're told that there's this land, there's this whole continent, and there are people living on it, a whole civilization, but we're not going to even consider it being discovered until your people come there. It's not even worthy of being, you know, identified as being discovered. And what does that tell you? Is that tells you that your people are superior. And he said, so white people have been told since kindergarten that they are superior. So it's not like it's a quick fix. It's like, but then in addition, if you're told that as a white person, then what are you told as a Black person? You know what I mean? If you're only told one person's history, if everything, and it's you know, it's interesting. There's so much. And his interview was because right now the whole conversation is about critical race theory, and it's like a boogeyman conversation because that was never taught. That's not taught. Like, Florida schools don't teach critical race theory. They don't talk about Black culture the same way they taught. It's like a meaningless point. Like, the education that we receive has to be done at home, in public schools. You know, I mean, that's normally what it is. That's why I received most of my education was at home. That's the way that it is.
I must confess that I'm one of those that didn't know anything about the Black Wall Street. When I grew up in the public schools here in D.C., they told us about Christopher Columbus, and they told us about George Washington never told a lie. You know, I got that, but I didn't hear anything about Tulsa or anything like that. There's an interesting chapter that really prick my interest because I have a couple degrees in religion and in ethics, and many Black members of the clergy who have used their voice and interpretation of scripture to address injustice. And they use the gospel to promote justice for the undeserved and disadvantaged. But they've been criticized by evangelicals as being political people. You're in politics, you're mixing that up. Do you find anything hypocritical about that?
That's why I did a whole chapter about it, you know. I mean, and I interviewed, I'm a member here of First Baptist Church of Glenarden, and my pastor is Pastor John K. Jenkins, and I actually interviewed him for this book. And he talked about his frustration with the silence of the white clergy in particular at incidents of police brutality. And it was right after the George Floyd killing. And, you know, the whole country, the whole world was in an uproar. And he was like, yeah, but there was this deathly silence from white evangelicals, from white evangelical leaders. And he was like, that's the opposite of what the Bible calls for. The Bible calls for us to be, you know, to speak out against injustice, to stand for. He's like, that's what we're called by scripture to do. I also interviewed Bishop Talbert Swan, who, you know, talked a lot about the history of the way that Christianity was used to justify slavery, the changing of what Jesus looked like, the changing of, you know, we went through the whole history. And I interviewed only Christians for this chapter. It wasn't a bashing because I am a Christian as well. But Christianity has been used to implement and promote white supremacy throughout the America's history. One part that was interesting about that chapter, I interviewed Steph Curry, who you know is a devout Christian, and he's talking about why he couldn't support Donald Trump. And he said, well, you know, I'm a devout Christian, and the principles of Christianity are one thing, and everything that he sees Donald Trump about is something else. And he was like, I don't understand how people who call themselves Christians are supporting him, but everything that he is about is the opposite of what is supposed to be Christ-like. And he was like, and it's not a matter of judge. He's like, how could I support him? And then, you know, they made this big thing about he didn't know if he wanted to go to the White House. He's like, but how could I support him? He was like, how could I? He's like, Christianity is something that I take very personal. Like he said, I devote my whole life to trying to be Christ-like. I thought that was I hadn't heard him speak that passionately about his beliefs. But it was important and I feel as a Christian, to call out white evangelicals if they do something that's hypocritical, but they're doing it in the name of Jesus. If that makes sense. So that's why I wanted to devote a whole chapter to it. So we talked about a lot in that chapter. That was a very deep and thorough chapter about evangelicals and the history of the way that Christianity was used to promote white supremacy.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite chapters there because of what faith does with my life. But I am retired Judge Alexander Williams Jr., the executive director of the Judge Alexander Williams Jr. Center for Education, Justice, and Ethics. And I've been interviewing Etan Thomas, a NVA veteran who has been authoring several books. And before I ask you the last question, Etan, can you once again tell our listeners the name of your book? And you've got to get this book. Those of you who are viewing today and joining us, you've got to get this book. What is the title again, Etan?
So the title is Police Brutality and White Supremacy, the Fight Against American Traditions. And yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
All right. And as a final message to those joining with us today, Mr. Thomas, what are some of the suggestions you have for citizens who are inclined to want to engage in the reform and reduction of racism and injustice? What do you suggest?
There's so much. I mean, first there has to be a whole re-education. You know, and I think it was Breonna Stewart, the WNBA player, that said that it's not enough for white people to just not be racist. She said that's what she hears a lot of around her peers. She said, you know, people say, well, I'm not racist. And she said, okay, well, that's cool, but you have to be against racism. And she quotes Angela Davis, who said something to that effect. I think that there is a dedication there. after George Floyd's murder was shown all over the place, and it resonated with a lot of mainstream America in a way that was different than a lot of the previous murders. I don't know why. Maybe it was because of COVID and everybody was kind of locked down, and I don't know, but it resonated a little bit more for a little while, and then it seemed like people went back to regular after a while. But the problem is still there. I mean, when you look at the number of police murders that have happened since George Floyd, you'd be alarmed. You don't hear about all the things. That's why I really wanted to interview the family members and stress that holding police officers accountable is not being anti-police. It is not. In order for a society to properly function, everyone needs to be held accountable. Everyone, top to bottom. If you're a parent, you have to hold your children accountable. You know what I mean? If you're a teacher, you hold your students accountable. Every facet of society has to have accountability. So it makes no sense for the entity to not have that accountability, for a position as serious and vital as policing. And I think the system and the way that it's set up is not a bad apples situation. It's a system that needs to be adjusted, and that comes with accountability. So really paying attention to what's going on around you is something that is really important. And I want that to be one of the main takeaways from this book, from an education standpoint, to knowing what's going on and knowing that, that the way that things are described in the media is not always what they are. And as we just talked before about defunding the police, because some people, as soon as they heard defunding the police, they might immediately think one thing, but then they hear an explanation. They're like, oh, well, I don't disagree with that. You know what I mean? That would be good to have called a different entity that is equipped and handled to be able to deal with a non-violent, a life-threatening type of a situation. But it's good to look deeper into situations, into what you're being told. So there's a lot of different things I want people to get out of the book.
All right, you've heard from Mr. Etan Thomas, 11-year NBA veteran, a poet, a powerful speaker, an author, and I call him a civil rights warrior. Mr. Thomas, thank you so much for joining with us this morning and allowing me to interview you. I am retired Judge Alex Williams, the executive director of the Judge Alexander Williams Jr. Center for Education, Justice, and Ethics. I thank you, Mr. Thomas, and all who joined with us today. This was some powerful information that you have given us. And again, I encourage all who joined us to get that book and read it and study it. It has some good information in it. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for having me again. Much respect to you. Thank you, sir.